All right, well, I am very happy to be here. If you're wondering what a guy with a film degree has to do with apologetics or the Shroud of Turin, I would say that, one of my first interests in apologetics, one of my guidances into the world of apologetics when I was really young was the world of the paranormal, as odd as that may sound. And those were the kinds of things that I enjoyed reading about, ghosts and aliens and Bigfoot and Loch Ness Monster, all that weird stuff. So I was, the kind of the weird kid who was interested in that stuff. And the Shroud of Turin is typically kind of thrown into the category with those things. So I read about it early on, but it wasn't until much later when I was much deeper into apologetics that I discovered that there was much more to the Shroud of Turin than just ghost stories. Happy Halloween, by the way, and happy Reformation Day. So this is one of my favorite topics in apologetics. Just out of curiosity, how many of you here tonight are basically brand new or know next to nothing about the Shroud of Turin? Okay, so everybody's heard of it. Everybody's heard whispers of it and maybe seen a program or two about it. Good, because my goal tonight is to convince you that the Shroud of Turin is authentically the burial shroud of Jesus of Nazareth. So let's get started. This is the Shroud of Turin. This is the full cloth. It is made of linen. It is 14 feet long by almost 4 feet wide. There are 3 components that we'll be talking about tonight. 3 components, 3 categories, if you will. The first one is the elemental substances, which is what is the cloth made of and what is on it, such as the linen out of which it's made, the elemental effects on it. You can see that these distinct triangles here, those are actually scorch marks from a fire. And we'll talk about that a little later on. There's also water damage on the shroud, and there are a lot of other things that have affected it over the years. Second category are the blood stains on the shroud. There are actual blood stains on the shroud, and they are actual blood. The third category is, of course, the image itself, which is neither one of the elemental substances nor part of the blood stains. And the image is definitely the most interesting and mysterious part. The concept of the Shroud of Turin is that it was the burial cloth that Jesus was placed in the tomb and wrapped in. So his back would have been laying on this side, and the shroud would have been folded lengthwise over him. So that's why this is the back side of him, and this is the front side of him, and why there are no side images. So it would have been folded that way over his head. This is a close-up of just the front side. So there are 4 lines of evidence that I'm going to be talking about tonight. The first line is the historical evidence, tracing the shroud's movement geographically through history. There is the artistic evidence that the shroud affected the history of the art of Jesus. There is the scientific evidence concerning the image itself. And then there is the medical forensic evidence that deals with the blood and the details of the wounds on the image. So, in all 4 categories of these, my argument is in the positive. As far as the historical evidence goes, I'm arguing that it is the authentic burial shroud of Jesus and that we can pretty much trace it through history. Along the artistic lines, the shroud has affected the artwork of Jesus over the centuries, and there's a very specific moment in history when all of a sudden the paintings of Jesus change and become much more like the shroud. So I'll point that out to you. I will argue how I believe and how most shroud researchers believe the image got on the shroud. And I will argue that the forensic evidence concerning the blood stains and some of the other stuff on the shroud is authentic and real. All right, so let's start with the history. As we go through the history, I'm also going to interject some of the art evidence. So you'll see how the artwork of Jesus has changed over the centuries. So, beginning of the story, most of you know it's in the Bible. I recommend reading it. It's a good book. It's the good book. The Gospels of Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John detail Jesus' ministry specifically. Jesus' ministry was from 30 to 33 AD. Those are our best historical guesses, and most scholars agree on that, of course. As you know, Jesus was beaten by soldiers. He was tried and convicted. He was flogged with a Roman scourge. A crown of thorns was placed on his head. He was forced to carry his cross up a hill. He was crucified at the top of that hill. And to make sure that he was dead, he was stabbed in the side with a Roman spear. He suffered very seriously. And that is the story that is presented in the Bible. All of these details are in the Gospels. And 33 AD was that year. The Gospels detail what was done with Jesus' body when he was dead. Mark says, Joseph of Arimathea bought fine linen, took Jesus down and wrapped him in the linen, and laid him in the tomb. Matthew says, when Joseph had taken the body, he wrapped it in a clean linen cloth and laid it in his new tomb. Luke says, then he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a tomb. And John agrees. Then they took the body of Jesus and bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as the custom of the Jews is to bury. I think it's really important to note here that all four of the Gospels make specific mention of the linen that was in the tomb. Plot twist. He's not dead. Peter arises and runs to the tomb, and stooping down, he sees the linen cloths lying by themselves. It's a very specific detail in Luke. And John has even more to say. John, stooping down and looking in, sees the linen cloths lying there. And then Simon Peter sees the linen cloths lying there, and the handkerchief that had been around his head. So that's two cloths we have talking about now. The linen cloths and the handkerchief that was on his head. And they were folded separately apart from themselves. So whoever moved Jesus' body, or if Jesus himself moved his body, apparently he likes being tidy, so they folded the cloths up and put them by themselves. Now, what happens next with the linen cloth is a little blurry when it comes to history. And the reason is because if there was anything that the apostles wanted to keep that had belonged to Jesus, or anything that they thought was important, because the Christians, after Jesus' resurrection, were persecuted heavily, they had to keep a lot of things secret. They had to stay hidden. There were things that they couldn't talk about out in the open. There were things that they couldn't write down. And part of that is the reason why it's difficult to trace the exact progression of the writings of the Gospels up until the end of the first century, because a lot of this stuff was just being handed around in secret. But we do know from history, from the writings of the early church fathers, that the apostles and the disciples spoke in a secret code, if you will. It was called the discipline of the secret. That's a name given to it by some of the early church fathers. It was a code language that the early Christians used to protect themselves from being found out by the oppressive government. And it was used until the 5th century. So those first 5 centuries of Christianity are shrouded in some obscurity because we weren't exactly sure what they were doing and what they were talking about. So a lot of research has to try to decode this discipline of the secret. This is where the Christian fish comes from. So, the one you put on the back of your car, the bumper sticker, the fish, that's because the word fish in Greek was an acronym for, what was it? It was an acronym for Jesus, Lord of all, or something like that. Jesus, our Lord and Savior. So the fish means Jesus. So if you're reading early Christian writings and they say something about a fish, they're talking about Jesus, not a fish. There is an apocryphal writing called the Gospel of the Hebrews. It is lost. We don't have it. We only have quotes of it from the early church fathers. But we use it to kind of get insight into what those early Christians were thinking and maybe some of the things that they knew as well. So it's used for some theological purposes, but it also has some historical details in it that go along with the Gospels themselves. One of the quotes from the Gospel of the Hebrews that we get from one of the early church fathers says, "And when the Lord had given the linen cloth to the servant of the priest, he went to James and appeared to him." The servant of the priest probably refers to Peter, who was traditionally known as the priest, bearing the hand of the priesthood. And the reason for that is, of course, Jesus blesses Peter during his ministry and says, "Upon this rock I shall found my church." So it's very likely that, according to the discipline of the secret, that the Gospel of the Hebrews is indicating that Jesus gave the linen cloth to Peter. So where did Peter spend a significant amount of time? If we assume that Peter has the cloth, I mean, he is kind of everybody's boss now. He's the head of the church. He is the rock upon which the church is founded. It would make sense that he would have this very important relic. And, of all the Christians out there, I think he of all people would be interested in keeping it safe. Peter spent a significant amount of time in Antioch. We know that. Now, Antioch was the third most important city in Rome, next to Constantinople and
Rome.
Yeah, and Rome, yeah. I'm sorry, yes, and Rome. Antioch is where Paul began his evangelism to the Gentiles, and Antioch is where the word Christian began. We know that from the book of Acts. And Antioch was also where Luke was from, who wrote Luke and Acts. And Antioch came to be called the cradle of Christianity. So between Jerusalem and Antioch, those were the two major hubs for Christians at the time. Paul refers in Galatians chapter 3. Some of you have probably read this verse many, many times and just kind of glazed over it because you just took it for granted. But Shroud researchers, in accordance with studying the discipline of the secret, have discovered what could possibly be a reference to the shroud in the epistle to the Galatians. Paul writes, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified?" Now, I admit, when I first read this in this context, I was like, whoa, are you kidding me? Are you telling me that Galatians 3:1 is a reference to the Shroud of Turin all this time? I just kind of assumed that it was just that Paul was just saying that the crucifixion of Jesus was clearly described and preached to the Galatians. But if we understand that they're speaking from the discipline of the secret code language, it's very possible that this word that means portrayed is very specifically used in the New Testament in this single context. So it's very possible that Paul knew of something that he didn't necessarily want to be very specific about. And because Paul is saying that it was displayed to the Galatians before, that means that in accordance with what we know about their travels, it was Peter who would have gone to the Galatians first and would have had the shroud to show to them. So, just a thought. All right, so if Peter had the shroud, he would not have taken it with him to Rome in 55 AD. He would have either left it in Antioch or Jerusalem. So Peter's leaving for Rome. He says, what am I going to do with this thing? Can't take it to Rome. There's too much persecution. Where are you going to leave it? Jerusalem or Antioch? Jesus' brother James was head of the church in Jerusalem, which had been fairly peaceful. Jerusalem had undergone a lot of persecution until King Herod died in 44 AD. So there was a time there where there was a good bit of peace and it was okay for the Christians. But James was killed in 62, and Peter and Paul were martyred between 64 and 68 AD. Now, according to Athanasius, an image of our Lord and Savior at full length was taken from Jerusalem to Syria, Antioch is in Syria, in the year 68 AD in response to growing hostilities between Jewish zealots and their Roman rulers in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem's getting full of conflict between the Jewish rulers and the Romans. And in 70 AD, Jerusalem was sacked. Most Christians made for Antioch. It makes sense that the shroud would be moved to Antioch, regardless of who has it. Either it got to Antioch with Peter, or it was given to James, and somebody took it from James and then took it to Antioch. In 135 AD, the Roman Emperor Hadrian desecrated all known Christian holy sites in Jerusalem by constructing pagan temples and shrines over them, and this included Golgotha and Christ's tomb. So the bottom line is, the shroud would have most likely ended up in Antioch. So here we are at the end of the first century. This is one of the earliest paintings of Jesus that we know of. This is actually from Egypt. It's a Coptic painting. And it's difficult to tell from the picture, but you can tell that there are very plain features to it. It's a clean face, and it looks very much like, perhaps what an Egyptian would have looked like. All right. Between 177 to 189 AD, Abgar the Great, king of Edessa, converted to Christianity. He transformed Edessa into a Christian city. He requested permission to Pope Eleutherius to be baptized. A guy named Aversius Marcellus was probably sent to Abgar because he was the bishop. He was a bishop. Aversius records his travels in this on this monument right here, and in it he says that he was given to take to Edessa a fish of exceedingly great size, which possessed wine of great virtue that was mingled with bread. Now remember what I said about fish earlier? Now obviously he couldn't mean that he was given Jesus, right? And that he took an exceedingly large Jesus. But remember, the shroud is 14 feet long. It's a bit big to tote around. If he was given that to take to Edessa to ceremonially honor the baptism of Abgar, then according to the discipline of the secret, their code language, that's what he would have called it. A fish of exceedingly great size, which possessed wine of great virtue, which was the blood of Christ, the wine, and that was mingled with bread, which would be the image of his body. So, here's the movement of the shroud so far. Obviously, Jesus was crucified and resurrected in Jerusalem. At some time, the shroud seems to have been moved to Antioch. And then Aversius ended up moving the shroud at some time to Edessa. So for some length of time, the shroud was in Edessa, and there was probably much to do about it because Abgar instituted Christianity in Edessa forever, for the foreseeable future. That's a very important detail. Tuck that away in the back of your head. All right, here's another very early painting of Jesus from somewhere in the 1st to 3rd century. This is a Romanized Jesus as the Good Shepherd. And this was kind of a common motif in Roman representations of Jesus. They heard that he was a shepherd of his flock, so they decided to depict him as a shepherd. Now he's Romanized because he's clean cut, he's got short hair. He looks like a Roman, right? This painting is in Rome. Now keep in mind, if the only people who know about the shroud are the Christians who have been in Jerusalem, Antioch, and Edessa, there's probably nobody in Rome that's going to know about it, right? Or has seen it. This is a 3rd century fresco. Same deal. Also in Rome. Good Shepherd. Very clean cut, short hair. Also looks very young. It looks more like how we would imagine like David when he was fighting Goliath. This is a 3rd century fresco of Jesus in Rome again. He's got longer hair this time, but he's still clean shaven. See, nobody in Rome knew what he looked like. From 190 to 306, Christian persecution increased all over the empire, forcing Christians to hold to the discipline of the secret. So, when persecution tightens up, you got to keep that code language going to move people around and preserve relics. Also, many Christians began to consider iconography to be sacrilegious, which forced anyone who was in possession of the shroud to beware of anyone who would dare to destroy an image of Christ for whatever reason. And I won't go into the theological reasons for why people started to accept this idea that iconography was bad, but it spread pretty far, because in 260, Arianism basically took prominence in Antioch. Now, Arius was the one who was propagating this idea that Jesus was not co-eternal with God. He would say that Jesus was divine, but he wasn't always around. He would say he was created by God, but he was still divine. But most Christians did not hold to that theology, so it kind of broke out kind of a civil war. So Antioch was not a safe place to be all of a sudden here at the end of the 3rd century. This is a early 4th century mosaic from England, believe it or not. Well, I'm sorry, it's held in England. But you can see, again, no beard, short hair. It has a very English look to it. All right. In 337, Constantine died, and his son Constantius took power and embraced Arianism. So all of a sudden, Arianism is the thing all over the kingdom. In 357, the Arians took control of Antioch. A native of Antioch named Theodore wrote about the deacons there spreading linen cloths on the altar. So you have the Arian Christians who were using a linen cloth to spread on the altar, basically for their Eucharistic rites, for the communion. The details of this, I looked up the original writing document of this. It is really quite amazing the way that this linen cloth is described. For the sake of time, I'm going to kind of go through this, but rest assured, in accordance with the discipline of the secret, it's kept vague, but the way that he talks about specifically the linen cloth that they used as being one with the divine nature and being something that was awe-inspiring, is being something that it would provoke silent reverence throughout for everyone who saw it. Seems a bit much for someone who would be just looking at a tablecloth. This is more of that. In 362, a fire burned down the temple of Apollo. Emperor Julian got mad. He blamed the Christians, and he ordered that the cathedral in Antioch be closed and its treasures confiscated. But an Arian named Theodorus, not the same as Theodore from before, hid the treasures before they could be confiscated. So now you have the Christians in Antioch, the Arian Christians in Antioch, who have the shroud, and when they are ordered to turn it over, this guy Theodorus decides to hide it. And we know from ancient writings that Theodorus suffered execution because he would not reveal the secret location of the treasures that he had hidden. And they referred to the treasure which he had hidden, and whose hiding place he refused to divulge. So now the shroud is hidden somewhere in Antioch in 362. Well, the people in Antioch were still there. They still knew about the shroud. So it's very possible that if they started making artwork as the Orthodox Christians took over the Arians, that they would have recognized the shroud in their art. So this is a sculpture of Christ from the Theodosian era, from 370 to 410, and you can see that it looks very much more like the shroud than before. So this is our first just kind of hint that maybe people who knew what the shroud looked like were taking it seriously as the actual face of Christ. Now from 528 to 538, going ahead a few hundred years, Antioch was reconstructed because much of it had been torn down. Now, according to a monk named John, there was an awesome image of Christ, which was an object of particular veneration, that showed up in the district of the city's gate, called the Gate of the Cherubim. And according to the historian Downey, it was an image of Christ. This is where things are a little complicated historically, if it wasn't already complicated. Note that in Antioch, the shroud shows up at the gate of Antioch. It shows up in the district that's adjacent to the gate where people would go in. Now, this is an important detail to remember because there's a legend later from Edessa, a different city, that the shroud or an image of Christ was also found at the gate in Edessa. And it would seem that this was a confusion in the legend, that maybe the people in Edessa remembered when this image had been in Edessa, and that they started mixing these legends together. This is what's sometimes difficult with history. Real quickly, there is forensic evidence on the shroud itself that would point to it being held in a jar with water damage on one side if it was folded a certain way. We can see that. You can kind of see the picture of that here. So it makes sense that it would have endured that kind of damage. All right, so in 540, Antioch was sacked again and just completely destroyed. However, there was a bishop of Antioch named Ephraimius who had a lot of political connections, and he was in charge of the church there. And he made a deal with the king of Persia, who was sacking Antioch, that the church not be destroyed and the church's treasures not be destroyed. Now, what's interesting is we know that Ephraimius fled the city anyway. Now, he was friends with the king of Persia. There was no reason that he would have needed to flee, but it seems like he was interested in keeping something safe. At this point in history, this word akaropoieta starts to be used. This word akaropoieta. Akaropoieta means not made by human hands, and it is only used to refer to two specific artifacts, which are the image of God incarnate, which is what they called the image that was at Antioch, and the image of Edessa, which was the image of Christ that they had in Edessa at the time. So you have these two artifacts now, and the legends of these two artifacts are getting mixed up together, okay? But both of them are referred to akaropoieta. Those are the only two things that are referred to that way. And they may be referring simply to the same thing. I'll get into this just a little bit later. The image of Edessa was just the head, and the image of God incarnate was the full body. All right, so researchers believe that Ephraimius took the shroud from Antioch to Cilicia. That would have made sense. And he would have intended for the Orthodox Christians there to return it to Antioch eventually, but he died in 545 and didn't get to oversee that. So in 554, a group of Orthodox priests who have something really cool start parading an image of Christ around Cilicia and Cappadocia. They start just taking this thing out and showing it to everyone, like, hey, look what we've got. Hey, Cilicia, Cappadocia, look at this thing. It's really cool. Now, Cilicia and Cappadocia are they're not cities specifically, they're regions. This region here is Cilicia, and this region here is Cappadocia. So this entire area, there's just priests wandering around with this image of God incarnate saying, hey, everybody, look at this. Isn't this cool? Now, why is that important? Because exactly at that moment in history, the paintings of Jesus completely change. This is a 6th century painting called the Pantocrator. It was copied over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. You've seen version after version after version of it. This is in the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, Egypt. So the Christians were getting around, right? Now, because the image of God incarnate was being seen for the first time by all these people from all over the world, it's an affecting thing. You know, when you first see the shroud, it's affecting. When you see it, you go, wow, that's something I didn't expect to see and something I've never seen before, something I'll likely never see again. And people take note. What's interesting about the Pantocrator is that it has this duality to it. The artist who painted it wanted the right side of it to portray the mercy of Christ. So he has a softer complexion, and he has kind of a symbol of mercy. And then on the other side of the painting, he looks like a God of justice, and he's holding the book of the law. This was an artistic representation. However, shroud researchers have noted that there are a lot of similarities between the Shroud of Turin and Pantocrator. There's an art historian named Hans Belting who interestingly argued, he didn't know about the shroud, that Pantocrator had to have been based on some kind of model. It had to have been based on like a human, and the painter would have actually been painting a human, which would have been a new thing for Christians at the time who were formerly against icons. But shroud researchers Mary and Alan Wenger identified 150 points of congruence between the shroud and the Pantocrator. To put that in perspective, only 45 to 60 points of congruence are what are deemed as standard for modern forensic investigations used in court. So the Shroud of Turin and the Pantocrator have double the amount of points of congruence that would be necessary to match them in a court of law. They identified 5 elements that can be used when looking at any paintings of Jesus to identify, we call them archetypes. All right, so some of these archetypes that match the shroud are wide spacing between the cheeks and the hair. So the hair is parted so that it's not on the face. The beard is displaced a little bit sideways. The mustache is non-symmetrical, and there is a forehead blood pattern imprint. And some people would have known that it was blood, and some people would have thought it was just some kind of symbol. And the face is asymmetric. On the shroud, we understand that that's because the cheeks are swollen. But if an artist was trying to duplicate the shroud as a painting, he might choose the duality that the artist of the Pantocrator chose and give it meaning. I'm going to skip over this arrow right here. All right, here's another Egyptian painting from the 7th century. By 692, the shroud has made its way to Constantinople because of various, that's what I skipped over, it's just a lot of exchanging of cities and cities being sacked and bishops and priests moving from here to there and political connections, and it's very nitty-gritty. But the point is by 692, the shroud was definitely in Constantinople. And Justinian II, who was a Christian, he started minting these gold coins called solidus coins. This is actually where we get the word soldier from, because these gold coins were used to pay the soldiers, the military, in Byzantium. Shroud researchers have calculated a 99.99% similarity to the Shroud of Turin. It's really remarkable the amount of detail they put into minting these coins, even so far as mistaking this double fold in the linen in the shroud to be a picture of the hem of Jesus' robe, or the hem of his garment here. All right, so from 741 to 775, Constantine V reigned in Byzantium. The Christian culture had grown wary and dogmatic about iconography, so Constantine V ordered that the image of God incarnate, which was in Constantinople, be sealed away in a gold case forever, never to be shown to anyone else. Only the emperor would be allowed to look at it. From here, the image of God incarnate began to be seriously confused with the image of Edessa, which I'm going to tell you the legend of Edessa in just a moment. But in 842, the icons were returned to the churches of Byzantium, not necessarily kept in the in the palace with the king. So a little bit about the legend of Abgar. If we rewind a little bit, there's a legend that comes out of the city of Edessa that King Abgar V in 32 AD, during the lifetime of Jesus, got sick. And he had heard about Jesus, so he sent a letter to Jesus saying, hey, can you come to Edessa and heal me? And Jesus politely declined, but said that sometime later in the future he was going to send him an apostle. And supposedly it was Thomas who sent one of his disciples to Edessa at the time, and he had an image of Christ with him, as the legend goes. And supposedly, according to the Edesians, that image was left there, and they kept it. We know from the rest of history that's probably not likely, but regardless, in 525, a large flood struck Edessa. A lot of people were killed, and a lot of buildings were destroyed. And while repairing a part of the city wall near the gate, there was a cloth discovered inside the gate. You can already see there's a lot of similarities here between the account at the gate of Antioch. The cloth had an image of Jesus on it, and they assumed that the Christians from 57 AD had probably hidden it in the wall, and from then on it became known as the image of Edessa. So it's kind of important to point out now that from approximately 800 AD to 942 AD, there were two icons in existence. One was the image of Edessa, which was also called the Mandylion by other people in Edessa. And then there was the image of God incarnate, which was in Constantinople. And this is a little confusing. I'm going to go ahead and try to clear this up. So this is an early medieval picture of what people thought the image of Edessa looked like. But it seems that if you really examine the historical evidence, the image of Edessa was really just a head picture, as this 8th century portrait of the image of Edessa displays. You see people unfolding it, yes, but it's just the head. It's just the head of Christ. And it does look like the shroud. That's true. Also, we have this 10th century painting of King Abgar with the image of Edessa. Again, it's just the head. Here's an 11th century portrait from Greece. It looks a lot like the shroud. Also, toast tends to resemble the shroud these days as well. All right. Anyway, so in 944 AD, the image of Edessa had become so popular that the Byzantine Emperor Romanus Lecapenus seized the cloth and brought it to Constantinople to be added to his collection of Christian relics. So through the year 1204, both Ikaropoieton are now in Constantinople. Both icons are now in Constantinople. From this time forward, history gets a little fuzzy, but this icon starts to emerge and become very popular. It's called the Epitaphios. It just depicts Mary holding Christ. He's died. I'm not sure who the other person is supposed to be, perhaps John. But that icon is, over time, starts to be adjusted to what looks more and more like the shroud. So this picture depicts a version of it that was used in Hungary. It was called the Prayer Codex. And you can see that they started making adjustments. What I was looking at here was the reason why Hungary would have known about the Shroud of Turin is because the future king of Hungary was king with the Byzantine emperor's daughter, and he was supposed to marry her, but he didn't end up doing that, so he became the king of Hungary. That's how history works. It's like Days of Our Lives. King of Hungary knows about the Shroud of Turin is the point, and he starts adjusting the Prayer Codex to fit the Shroud of Turin, down to really weird details. Like, for example, there's the hands are one thing. That's the positioning of the body. That's one thing. But then there's these just like weird dots on the linen itself. And the reason for that is because on the shroud, there are these holes that now we call them poker holes. It wasn't actually from pokers. Researchers believe they're there from a hot incense being dripped on the shroud accidentally. But, it's in this weird 7 pattern, and somehow it makes it onto this Prayer Codex in Hungary. That's extremely specific and very difficult to argue with. In the year 1200, Emperor Alexius was a sacrilegious man, and he defied the imperial covenant about not showing the image around to anyone, and he said, okay, fine, you guys can have it. So he just gives it to kind of the churches around, which means that now more people have a wider access to the image of God incarnate and the image of Edessa. In 1204, Constantinople is sacked by France, and the Mandylion, aka the image of Edessa, now belongs to the Knights Templar. I'm going to rush through some of this. This is where some of the history of the Shroud starts to make a little more sense. Well, I should say, a Crusader knight named Robert de Clary reported seeing both icons in Constantinople during the sacking of Constantinople. He saw the image of God incarnate, and he saw the Mandylion hanging in the midst of a chapel by two silver chains. And he said that because the emperor had basically released them to everyone, the leaders of the church would actually put them on display every Friday. You would just put them up on display so everyone could see. However, Robert de Clary also pointed out that he didn't know, and nobody he knew, it seemed like nobody knew what happened to these images once the city was actually finished being sieged. There's a hint that in 1201, which would have been at the beginning of that siege, that the sacred linen was taken to Athens. We have good reason to believe that this is pretty legit. So now the image of God incarnate has moved from Constantinople to Athens, and the Knights Templar have possession of the Mandylion / image of Edessa. Two different things. 1204 to 1357 we call the missing years. We don't have clear evidence of what exactly happened to the image of Edessa / the Mandylion or the image of God incarnate. We don't have any specific way to connect those things to the Shroud directly. However, the window has closed a good bit, even compared to what we knew just a few years ago. So it's closing, and perhaps eventually we will close it completely. But there are a few hypotheses. So what I want to show you real quick, in the history of the Shroud, the definitive history of the Shroud of Turin begins up here in France. We have no questions about what happened to the Shroud in the 1300s because it's clearly in history. It starts to be called the Shroud of Turin. It shows up here in Liary and ends up in Turin, eventually in Turin, Italy. These two cities of Chambéry and Besancon have to do with some of the hypotheses of how the Shroud would have got from Athens up to France, and also how the image of Edessa might have got from Constantinople to Turin if it's the Shroud of Turin. And I'll explain why I don't think the image of Edessa is the Shroud of Turin in just a moment. One of the hypotheses is the Besancon hypothesis. There was a crusader named Orthon de la Roche. He was the great-great-grandfather of Jeanne de Vergy, who was the wife of Geoffrey de Charny, who is the first person, notably in history, to have actual possession of the Shroud. We know that Geoffrey de Charny had the Shroud in the 1300s. His wife's great-great-grandfather was Orthon de la Roche, who was a crusader known to have been in Constantinople at the time. There was even a 13th century coffer, kind of like a sarcophagus, but not really, that has a modern label placed on it that says that it was, fairly modern label placed on it, that said that it encased the Shroud. But nobody knows for sure if that's actually true or if it's just kind of a fantastic claim that they like to make. Actually, it's a pretty good hypothesis. The problem is we just don't have all the connecting parts to make it work exactly, but it's probably the most tame hypothesis. There is the Sainte-Chapelle hypothesis, which is that the Mandylion was awarded to Geoffrey de Charny by King Philippe VI for his great services to France. It's a little less likely. It seems like a pretty big gift to give to somebody who just did some great things for France. here, have this image of Christ. By far the most interesting hypothesis, though, is the Knights Templar hypothesis, which kind of fills in this gap from 1204 to 1307. So the Knights Templar, they were a famous group of French knights. They rose to power, gathering an impressive amount of Christian relics. It was known that initiates into the order were shown an image, a head, of the Lord during the order's secret rituals. And a painting found in 1951 in a Templar ruin in England shows a knight kneeling before an image of a floating head, and it looks very much like the paintings of the Mandylion. And in 1307, King Philip the Fair suppressed the order to display the image, and a raid of the Knights' headquarters in Paris failed to find the image. So somebody in the Knights Templar would have hidden the image. Now, concerning the fact that it was just the head, there is evidence on the shroud that it has been folded at some points in history to just show you the face of it. This has been done with forensic tests and everything to test the different ways that it could be folded. It is a little heavy. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that you would just hold up in a meeting and say, here, look at it, because it's almost 4 feet wide. So what I'm going to propose to you is that the Knights Templar did not have the shroud. They had, I believe that the image of Edessa was probably a copy of just the head of the shroud made early on, perhaps even in the 1st century, which would be a big deal if we could find it, the actual image of Edessa. Probably a copy made of the shroud at that time. And that icon may have been hidden somewhere and rediscovered later on, and then because it was an image of Christ, it would have got confused with the image of the God incarnate that was in Antioch and Constantinople. But there's another legend in the Roman Catholic Church about the Veil of Veronica. And supposedly the Veil of Veronica was purportedly, Saint Veronica was a lady who came to Jesus while he was going up the hill to Calvary, and she went to wipe his face with a cloth. And when she did so, supposedly an image of his face was left on the cloth. It sounds like a legend, attempting to explain how an image of Jesus' face would get on a cloth. And if a painting or something like that was left on a cloth and then it got old and aged, people may have mistaken it for a keropoieton, right? Something not made with human hands. And it's very likely that it was copied many times over. And there's actually a lot of icons still in existence that we know resemble the so-called Veil of Veronica, even though we don't know which one was the original Veil of Veronica. So it's very possible that even though it was based on the shroud, it wasn't actually a keropoieton itself. It wasn't actually not made with human hands. It was just a copy of the shroud. And it plays into this Veil of Veronica legend. This painting was discovered in an old Knights Templar monastery up in England. It resembles all these copies of the Veronica. This portrait of Jesus was hidden. It was attached to the structure of the monastery in a way that it couldn't be seen unless it was specifically let go. So it was there for centuries before people discovered it, which aligns with the story of the Knights Templar hiding their image of Edessa. So it's very possible, I believe, that the image of Edessa was just one of these copies made of the shroud's face. Also portrayed as a full face, a living face, not a picture of a dead man like the shroud is. All right, so the Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake along with the Master of the Order in Normandy, France. Geoffrey de Charnay begins to make a name for himself in the 1300s. He was part of the military in France. Remember, the king thought about awarding him the shroud as a reward for his great service to France. He can't be the son of the Templars. He can't be related to the Templars, which you would think would, have him inheriting the shroud, but since his name is very similar to a lot of Knights Templar, it's very possible that he was related to them somehow from some distant relation. This is where the history of the shroud is concrete. This is when it becomes known as the Shroud of Turin, is in 1357. 1357, it's in France. It's in Liry, France, where de Charny is. Geoffrey died in battle in 1357. So his wife, attempting to make money, because her husband had died, decided to start putting this thing on display and making a profit off of it. Now, she never knew where her husband got the shroud. And since the Knights Templar were considered heretics at that time, her husband would not likely have wanted to reveal where it came from. Now, this is a 14th or 15th century medallion sold to pilgrims who visited the Holy Shroud in France. It shows the coats of arms of the Geoffrey de Charny family, because they were the first owners of it. And she did make a good bit of money off of this thing. So people would come visit the shroud in France, and then they would go to the gift shop and they would pick up this cool medallion. And you can see, we can go into the details of how it resembles the shroud all day long. Point is, this is concrete history at this point. Nobody disputes all of this. Between 1389 to 1532, the shroud changes hands from different churches in France for a while. In 1532, in France, the Saint Chapel in Chambéry almost entirely burns down, and the shroud was burned on its corners because it was in a silver box that melted onto the shroud. So we know that, in accordance with the way that it's folded, those little triangles you saw before are the burn marks from that fire. In 1578, the shroud is moved to Turin, Italy, where it is owned by the powerful House of Savoy. And the House of Savoy owned it for centuries. It was moved to the Cathedral of Turin. It did go on a few tours and exhibitions around Europe here and there, which is what this is a picture of one of its exhibitions somewhere. And people turned out all over the place to see it. It was kind of a big deal. In 1983, the shroud was officially granted to the Vatican, given to possession of the Vatican. Believe it or not, it was 1983 that happened.
1982, who owned it?
Savoy. I got Umberto of Savoy, who in World War II was temporarily king of Italy, but when he passed away, in his will, he left it to the Vatican. The Vatican decided, there was a big hullabaloo about what was going to happen to it. Were they going to take it to Rome, to the Vatican, or were they going to leave it in Turin? The church said, no, we just want to leave it in the Cathedral of Turin. It's been there for centuries, so that's what they did. And here we know that the shroud definitely starts influencing paintings to the point where people are making paintings of the shroud itself. Here's another one. People are very aware of it. All right, so let's move to the modern era. In 1898, during a public exhibition of the shroud, the Italian photographer Secondo Pia took the very first photographs of the Shroud of Turin, ushering it into the age of science. These are some of his photographs from 1898. So, Secondo Pia, being a photographer, he takes his pictures, he goes into the dark room, and what's the first thing he notices when he looks at his photo negatives? The shroud itself is a photo negative. Now, I know most of you know that used to be when you took pictures, you had to go get them developed, right? And the things you had to get them developed was because they were negative. They come out of the camera looking like this, on the film looking like this. They have to be developed so that the image is reversed. From the darks and lights are reversed. what Secundopia discovered in 1898 is that when you look at the shroud, you are looking at a photographic negative. Therefore, when he took the first pictures of the shroud and looked at his photo negatives, he was then looking at a positive image of the shroud. So this is the original image. This is what you would see if you were looking at it face to face. This is the photographic negative, which renders the image as a positive. Now, that's really interesting, right? But the reason that is really, really interesting is because no artist ever in the history of art ever had painted any image as a photographic negative. That concept didn't exist until the invention of photography in the late 1800s. So that means that if the shroud is a fake for some reason, the artist who made it was an artistic genius. Or a time traveler. Exactly. This is probably my favorite detail of the shroud, honestly. This defies explanation. There are no theories about this. There are no paintings that skeptics or atheists or anybody pull out and they say, well, here's a painting that's kind of a photographic negative. No, there's nothing. There is nothing to point to say this is what maybe the shroud could be. This is the rest of Secundopia's photonegative positive version of the shroud. What's really interesting is that when you look at a negative photograph of the shroud, converting the shroud into a positive image, a lot more details come out of the image, which is really unusual, which also makes it far more unlikely that it was done by a human artist. A lot more details come out about the body. A lot of the details concerning it, especially when you look at, zoom in on like the hands and stuff, there are details in there that just defy artistic explanation. So for most of the 20th century, people just, this lingering suspicion that maybe the Shroud of Turin was the real thing started to grow in people's minds, as it would. So in October of 1978, a team of a dozen scientists who called themselves the Shroud of Turin Research Project, we just say STURP, was granted special permission from the Catholic Church to conduct an extensive 120-hour hands-on investigation of the shroud. This is the only time in history this has been done. It has not been done since. So the research that was done in 1978 is what our research now is still based on. But for 120 hours straight, they did all kinds of tests and photographs on the shroud. They went in rotations. There was always someone awake working on the shroud for a period of 120 hours. Over the course of 5 days, this is what they did. They took photographic floodlighting pictures. In other words, they would light it from the back, they would light it from the front, they would light it from all angles and take pictures of it at different angles. They used low-power X-rays on it. They used narrowband ultraviolet light. They took sticky tape samples from the surface of it. They unstitched a side edge to look between the shroud and the backing cloth that had been sewn onto it. Because in medieval times, nuns in the church had started sewing on a back cloth to it just to, help it keep its form. That had never been done. 400 years old, it had never been unstitched. They did it in 1978. They obtained blood-stain samples from the lumbar region on the back. They didn't want to they tried not to mess with the front as much as possible, but everything on the back was kind of up for grabs.
Do they have the blood type?
Yes, they do. It is blood type positive AB. They took thousands of photographs and photomicrographs, or microphotographs, of the shroud. They used microscopes all over it. So I bet you're wondering what the results were, right? These scientists, after After nearly 2 millennia had passed that this shroud had been in circulation around the world, people are wondering, now what? Here's what they found. There is not a drop of paint on the shroud. It's not a painting. There is no paint. There is no dye. There is no artistic stains. There's no ink. There's no acids. There's no pigments. There's no powders. There is no substance on the shroud that an artist would use to make an image. And no substance that can cause a similar image has been found that could bind the fibrils together. So even though it kind of looks like a painting, it's not. There's no paint on the shroud. Although I should clarify one little detail. There is no paint on the shroud that makes up the image. There are, in fact, around the edges, small drops of paint around the edges because we know that it was copied. And that would match what I said earlier about it being copied in Edessa. It's probably copied in other places too. But the image itself is not made of any artistic substance. Furthermore, the image is only 1 fibril deep. So the linen cloth is made of woven fibers. Those fibers are also made of woven fibrils. The image itself is only on the topmost fibrils of the fibers. And where the fibrils cross each other, the image is only on the top fiber and not on the one below it. The image is purely over the top of the fibrils of the fibers.
Has any artist ever been able to do that?
No, they have not. The image does not bleed through the fibrils. This eliminates any theory of fluid causing, as if it's some kind of water stain or something. Under a microscope, this is absolutely impossible. I don't know if you can see this, but this is a picture of the fibrils. These darker ones here are of the image itself, and you can see that the ones under it are lighter. And we do have, there are pictures of them picking the fibrils up over each other, but I didn't get that. The image has 3D shading. So the shading of the image produces a three-dimensional picture when analyzed by a computer, meaning that the lighter part of the image means that the body was farther away from the cloth. If you do similar kind of computer analysis on a photograph, on something that we know is actually a photograph, you don't get the same kind of three-dimensional image. So there is information, there is three-dimensional information in the shroud that are not in photographs. It's kind of like a 3D animation, if you will, that when scanned into a computer turns into a 3D model. The image is best seen from a distance, which also makes it kind of hard to believe that an artist could somehow make it, because then he would have to do something really quick up close and then move away real quick and look at it and then run up and do something real quick and then run back and look at it. It's exhausting. He got his steps in that day. The negative shading of the shroud I've already pointed out. So this is a positive photograph of the shroud in its original negative form. It's enhanced so that you can, try to make out the details. The fibrils, the darker fibrils that cause the image are dark because they are aged. The cellulose comprising the fibrils has undergone a dehydrating, oxidizing reaction, causing it to age faster than the others. Newer research refined the cause of the darker color to be caused by existing carbon atoms in the cellulose molecules in the flax fibers being changed from single to double electron bonds.
What?
Radiation changed the carbon bonds on the shroud and formed the image. The darker areas of the image contain quantitatively more darkened fibrils. The fibrils themselves are not darker. So in other words, on parts of the shroud where the image is darker that does not mean that the fibrils themselves are more aged than others. It just means that there are more aged fibrils in that section. They're all aged the same. Are we having fun yet?
Yeah.
The burn holes, we've already mentioned, these triangular pieces. But as my father said, they were patches sewn on to fill in the holes from the burns. Mass spectrometer analysis reveals that there were no aloes, no oils, no proteins, no myrrh, no natural substance could have caused the image by contact with the dead body. So in other words, sometimes this is a real thing. If you place a cloth, if you place a dead body on a cloth or a cloth over a dead body, over time it will actually leave a stain on the cloth. But if you see one of these pictures, it's just a big oval is what it is. It's just a big blob. That's all it is. Because it's just the oil, it's just the natural oils from the body just staining the cloth. That's all it is. But that could not have been the cause of the image on the shroud because those aren't on the shroud. If the image has a purely natural cause, one would expect other images on other burial cloths to have been found. So in other words, we would have found other burial shrouds with images like this. The image is weight independent. So in other words, you have a body lying on a cloth and you have the cloth folded over the top of the body. But the image itself has nothing to do with the weight of the body. So the weight of the body on the back is irrelevant to the image on the back part of it. And the front and back images are of the same consistency, of the same depth on the fibrils. It has nothing to do with the pressure of the cloth on the body or the body's pressure on the cloth. The cloth contains vertical imaging. Computer analysis shows a complete lack of directionality to the image, meaning it lacks brush strokes, pastel or pencil streaks, finger smudging, or shading. The image was projected across space in a vertical direction, showing detail that would not have contacted a cloth draped over a body. In other words, there is information in the image of the cloth where the cloth did not touch the body, because it seems that, consider that the top of his head is not shown, which means that whatever caused it passed vertically through the body, either this way or this way. And that image,
Or both ways.
Or both ways, and caused the image on the shroud vertically. No attempt to duplicate the image has been successful, and research and duplication attempts have eliminated a lot of different techniques. They have eliminated direct contact, diffusion, lab-induced radiation. Even lab-induced radiation didn't work. Engraving, powdered bas-reliefs. So you make a statue, you drape a cloth over it, you stick it in an oven and bake it. That actually works in terms of putting an image on a cloth, but it does not produce an image like the Shroud of Turin. Electrostatic imaging doesn't work. Phosphorescent statues don't work. Hot statues don't work. The image is not of human origin. Humans cannot make it. Even with our best modern technology, we cannot do it. Which makes it very unlikely, it seems, that a medieval artist could have done it. And if they could have, surely they would have taken credit for it. They would have been like, this was me. They would have signed it at the bottom. Da Vinci. There is a crazy theory out there, since we're on these copies, so to speak, that people have attempted. You'll see articles like that pop up all the time. Oh, the shroud's been duplicated finally. Don't believe it. It's been tried. There's also a theory that Da Vinci did it somehow with some ancient photographic technique. But the funny thing about that is Da Vinci lived before the time it shows up in history. So for a skeptic to claim that contradicts the dating that they would prefer. So, the very best explanation for the image on the Shroud of Turin is vertical low energy X-ray radiation or some other kind of radiation emanating from the body under the cloth, causing the carbon atoms in the fibrils to bond differently than on the rest of the cloth. Such an event defies natural explanation. All right, well, that's enough about the image. Let's move on to the stuff on the cloth itself. There is actual blood on the shroud. It is type AB. It has X and Y chromosomes, meaning it comes from a male person. The DNA is degraded as ancient DNA should be degraded. Also, I might as well go ahead and say the blood is in anatomically correct places. So, for example, there are specific veins in the forehead. Doctors know of this. The blood is in the proper place. The nail wounds in the hands are actually in the wrists, which we know is physically necessary for someone to be crucified that way. A lot of early paintings of Jesus depict the nails going through his hands, but we know that that couldn't support the weight of the body hanging from a cross. They had to go through the wrist. So the fact that the shroud is centuries ahead on that is pretty mind-blowing. Also, the feet. When looking at the feet on the shroud, they're both visible. So there are different theories, and nobody's really sure how the Romans crucified the feet. There are multiple theories actually of how that works, but remarkably, the information on the shroud matches all of those theories. And one recent example is there was a skeleton, a body found of an ancient person who was crucified in Rome, and the nail found in the skeleton was put through his heel, and that would match directly with the shroud. The body on the shroud, as evidence from the 3D imaging, is in rigor mortis. The feet are in the crucifixion position rather than a resting position. The posture of the legs are bent, not limp. The thumbs are drawn in, as would happen if there was a nail driven through your wrist. The head is tilted slightly to one side, as if it had been hanging that way. The chest and the abdomen are frozen in their crucifixion position, and there's no flattening of the buttocks sitting on the cloth. The scourge marks on the back are outlined with serum from clotting blood, which is visible only under UV light, and there are 100 to 120 scourge marks.
And serum in each one.
There is serum in each of the blood. In each of the blood shows evidence of clotting with serum. So in other words, when a wound is open, there's extra ooze, if you will, that comes out with the blood. If you've ever scraped your knee when you were a kid, like riding a bike or something, or an elbow, you may have seen some of that coming out. It means that the wound was fresh and it was still actively bleeding. So whoever bled onto the shroud had an open wound. It wasn't just that blood was sprinkled on it somehow. It's that when the shroud came in contact with the body, the wound was open. And the wounds match the Roman flagrum, as evidence there. Okay, the blood flows on the scalp are anatomically correct. I already said that. There is watery fluid on the side, either from the pericardial sac or the pleural cavity, consistent with what surgeons and doctors say would happen if you stabbed a dead man with a spear in his side. There are no decomposition stains on the shroud. I already said that. The thumbs are not visible. That's because it's in rigor mortis. Also, in many of the paintings, early paintings that resemble the shroud, the thumbs are also not visible in those paintings, which is a further specific archetype of the shroud transferred to those paintings. So the conclusion is that the shroud wrapped a real dead human body. There are additional forensic details. I about the shroud, which are important to note within a historical context, particularly the pollen removed from the shroud in 1978 via sticky tape. Here you can see Max Frey, a researcher, using sticky tape on the shroud. Of the 58 pollens found on the shroud, only 17 are from France and Italy, 18 are from Edessa, and 13 are from Constantinople, and the rest are from Jerusalem. The pollens are only available at different times of the year, and some are insect pollinated rather than airborne. Considering these facts and the very limited displaying of the Mendelian and the shroud, the pollen evidence shows that the shroud has been in Jerusalem, Edessa, Constantinople, France, and Italy, just the right places to correspond from the burial of Jesus to the history of the Mendelian.
Did they carbon date the pollen?
I do not know, nor do I know if that is possible. I will say,
I don't know that that's possible. It wasn't in 1978.
in an attempt to be fair, the scientist who initially extracted the pollen was Dr. Max Frey. Unfortunately, he passed away in the middle of writing about his findings. So consequently, a lot of his work has been promulgated by word of mouth, and also rough translations of his Italian. So skeptics claim that the appearance of just the right pollens on the shroud is too convenient, and that Frey may have contaminated his own tape strips with samples that he knew would spark controversy. Proponents defend Frey out of a fond recollection of his friendship, but other people agree with the skeptics that almost nothing can be decided based on the unfinished research. So unfortunately, we have to take the pollen evidence with kind of a grain of salt, unfortunately. The same goes for the supposed images of flowers on the shroud. Max Frey's research was handed over to Dr. Alan and Mary Wanger, and they claim to have discovered plants on the shroud. Some people dispute the plants. It would be a really interesting find that some of these specific flowers only come from Jerusalem and only bloom at certain parts of the year, specifically the spring, which would have matched. But we do have to take those with a grain of salt, just trying to be honest. However, the images supposedly of coins on the shroud are actually very well supported. The shroud actually has coins over the eyes, which would have been in accordance with customs in the first century. And the coin that has been identified as being over the shroud even has a minting error that is known to archaeologists. So it's very specific what computers have been able to detect from these things. So anyway, so coins, yes. Pollen, maybe. Flowers, maybe. Regardless, we still have a lot of other information going on here.
The first century AD?
Yeah.
The coins, the image of the coins is in the same,
Is over the eyes.
but it's from the same X-ray stuff.
The coins come from the 3D computer analysis from the micro photographs.
What about
So it's a
the
different.
images of the flowers?
The images of the flowers are more purported. They weren't initially proposed by the photographers.
Okay.
So yeah, that's why. The flowers were an afterthought in the research. The Shroud of Turin is almost never placed on public display anymore. It's kept in the chapel in Turin. This is what it looks like now. It's in a high-tech reliquary that monitors its temperature, the air pressure, and the humidity. And they're not going to let anybody touch it.
They get to see it.
I don't even know who they are, but you can see they're not touching it. Sometimes it's put on display very briefly, in which case it's transferred to another reliquary, kept in its box. All right, so let me ask you, who remembers that handkerchief that went over the head from John? Yeah, what's about that? Well, here's the Sudarium of Oviedo. The Sudarium is a cloth used to cover a face during burial. Oviedo is a city in Spain. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo because that's where it is. It is a...
She doesn't have one.
Huh?
She said she didn't see a face.
It does not have an image on it, no, but it does have blood stains. The history of the sudarium is pretty well known. It begins in 614 AD. It was carried out of the east, possibly from Syria or Palestine, possibly. Came through Alexandria, it came through Egypt, came across North Africa, south of the Mediterranean. It was continually moved ahead of Persian forces, ultimately arriving in Oviedo, Spain. So just, you could call it by providence. It was just always ahead of the game in terms of its moving. The exact date of the arrival of the cloth in Spain is unknown, but it was definitely before the invasion of the Iberian Peninsula in the year 711. So sometime before 711, after 614, it arrived in Oviedo. And it has stayed in Oviedo ever since then. And it is a bloodstained cloth. It has bloodstains on it. The cloth itself is about 33 inches by 21 inches in size, so it's just big enough to go over the top, the face and the head. The blood on it is from a male. It's type AB. And the bloodstain patterns exactly match the bloodstain patterns on the Shroud of Turin. Also, in the year 2012, very recently, 57 X-ray fluorescence tests determined that dirt taken from the sudarium matches dirt samples from the Calvary site at Jerusalem. This is absolutely remarkable. We could go on all night about the sudarium of Oviedo. All right, now for the unfun part. All of this has been quite remarkable, right? Well, after the 1978 STURP team took samples from the shroud, they conducted carbon dating tests on it, on those samples. Unfortunately, the carbon dating results came to between the years 1260 and 1390. Unfortunately, that correlates exactly with the concrete appearance of the Shroud of Turin in history, which was in the mid-1300s. So skeptics like to use the carbon dating to say that it is a fraud of somehow. Even though we don't know how the image got there, it's obviously a fraud. Though there were different labs that did it, they were supposed to be testing blind. They knew which samples were from the shroud. We just know that they did. And which ones weren't, because they had like dummy ones. And they knew the dates of the dummy cloths as well. And after 3 decades, there is still not much agreement about what went right or wrong. On the one hand, it doesn't seem to be a coincidence that all 3 labs dated the shroud to precisely the moment it appeared in history. On the other hand, the objections to the test results are of an unusual variety given the strange circumstances surrounding the shroud itself. The shroud was in a fire. Maybe that affected the carbon testing. Some people said, nah, that doesn't work that way. A skeptic, Walter McCrone, has heavily contested this line of reasoning, citing scientific illiteracy for people. See, the problem is at this point, it's a lot of he said, she said. But according to McCrone, intense heat would not have affected it. However, McCrone himself has come under fire for twisting his own research of the blood on the shroud, claiming that the bloodstains were entirely composed of red ochre pigments. He actually claimed that in a paper, and every other shroud researcher threw a flag and said, no, absolutely not. So his dishonesty in one area has carried over to distrust and input on other areas. Consider also that the most likely cause of the image on the shroud is radiation by a low-level radiation source. Other linen cloths subjected to radiation and fire carbon have dated much earlier than their known age. Ironically, the cause of the image may have been the cause of the discrepancy in the carbon date. Also, the image on the shroud has been discovered to contain X-ray images of the man. So if you look at the shroud closely, you can actually see the skeleton of the man through the flesh of the man. It's specifically noticeable in the hands, but it is also noticeable through the rest of it in finer details.
In the teeth, too.
In the teeth, yes. Slightly visible in the teeth. So the question is did they test the right part of the cloth? So here you can see this is the front. This is the front section. They took the samples used for carbon dating from this corner down here, and this is a close-up of that corner, which already has a cut in it. They didn't take that. They took this right here. And these are the different laboratories where they were sent. So we have Arizona, Zurich, Oxford, second Arizona, and then this portion actually still exists. We still have it. And this raised fragment also we still have. The question is now is who gets to conduct tests on these things? Who is given the right? Who's going to oversee this and make sure it's done right? But the other question is, should we even bother does it even matter if we did carbon tests on these samples? Because we know that over history, the shroud has been handled by its edges. So it's been contaminated by people just holding it for centuries. And they would have held it from the corners, just like that. It's also possible that there might have snuck in a piece from the cloth that had been sewn to the back of it. So there are a lot of reasons to believe, and this is reasons to believe, that the carbon tests are not accurate. Unfortunately, we may not have that redone for a long time. The Catholic Church is not willing to consider this proposal, and again, it's a matter of who's going to do it and why. So, in consideration of everything you've heard tonight, you have the historical evidence that is all but a complete chain of references to a sacred linen throughout all of history, beginning from the 1st century all the way to the 1300s when the Shroud of Turin is well documented up to the present day. There's only a brief amount of time in there for about 150 years from the early 1200s up into the middle 1300s where we're really not sure who had the image of Edessa, who had the Mandylion, who had the image of God incarnate, or even how exactly those things were discerned. I argue, of course, that the image of Edessa was simply a copy of the shroud made a lot earlier, and a lot of copies of those were made throughout the centuries. And it's very possible that the legend of the image in Edessa was mixed up with the legend of the image of God incarnate in Antioch. That's what I argue. And using those arguments, it's very easy to imagine what happened in those 150 years. So we have almost a complete chain of history linking the shroud from its known location in France in the 1300s to the 1st century and in Jerusalem. The artistic evidence points out that the details of the shroud had to have been available in the 6th century exactly. And that's a lot earlier than the 1300s when the shroud first appears. But clearly, the Pantocrator and copies of the Pantocrator throughout the centuries match the shroud. So the artistic evidence heavily implies that the shroud has been available for centuries. The details of how the image was created are still a complete mystery. Nobody knows how it got there. The details are there's so many very tiny details to consider, including the fact that the image itself is tiny and it can only be viewed from a distance. And it's negative shading. The shroud itself is a negative photograph of the man on the cloth. And the medical forensic evidence from the blood on the shroud all matches the descriptions of the wounds from Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century, when Christians claimed that he bled for our sins and died for us and then gave us salvation. And the image itself is unexplainable to the extent where, if you imagine a God-man rising from the dead, what does that look like? I think most of us would probably imagine some kind of flash of light. Isn't that what you see in the movies? Isn't that what they do in the church skits at Easter time? There's always a flash of light, right? What if there really was a flash of light and it was radiation and it put that image on the cloth? That is as plausible an explanation for the image on the cloth as we have, the resurrected Jesus. So, not saying it was Jesus. Actually, I am. It was Jesus. There's just no other way to explain it. And skeptics sometimes pull out these weird arguments, things like, well, we can't know for sure that it was Jesus. We don't have an actual blood sample from Jesus to match to the shroud. We don't exactly know what he looked like, so we can't say if the shroud looks like him. And I'm just like, are you even listening to yourself? All the details match Jesus, and everybody sees it as Jesus. That's who it is. It is the resurrected Christ. So when I look at the shroud, and especially when I consider that the shroud itself is a photonegative, and that a negative photograph of the shroud renders a positive image, that's supernatural. It's a miracle. The shroud is undeniably a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And I can say personally that I haven't seen the shroud itself, but I've stood in front of a life-size photograph of it. And it is awe-inspiring, just like the Arian bishops described in all those centuries ago when they were looking at it. It compels you to be silent and gaze at it and ponder the wounds on the man depicted there. And if I may say that having been a Christian, a serious Christian for 15 years, I've come to know God, I've come to know Christ. And when I look at the shroud, I see him there. I see the God I know on the shroud. And there is a possibility, maybe it is a fraud, but the possibility is so minuscule at this point. And I think that, skeptics in today's day and age are always demanding scientific evidence. They want scientific evidence. They want scientific evidence that there's a God, that Jesus existed, that Jesus rose from the dead. And for centuries we've said, we don't even need this scientific evidence. We don't need that. We have the philosophical evidence. We have the historical evidence of Jesus. Technically, we don't need the Shroud of Turin to defend the historicity of the Gospels and the existence of Jesus, the existence of God, or even the fact that the resurrection occurred. We don't need it. But the fact that we have it, perhaps, is a mercy from God to those who demand to touch something, to have something to touch, just like doubting Thomas. I've got to put my finger in his hands. I've got to put my finger in his side before I'll believe. And I think that that God has given us the shroud to accomplish that very thing for us today. And I don't know what the future holds for the shroud. Unfortunately, the image is fading. It's disappearing like an old Polaroid photograph. And I don't know how long it'll be before it's completely gone. But even if we didn't get enough in on it, even if we don't get another go at investigating it, the STURP research from 1978 has been pretty thorough. So we have all this evidence, this little bit of carbon dating that might have questionable reasons for why it's wrong. And that's just why I say the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Thank you very much.